Wild Health is about optimizing you. We use genomics, blood work, biometrics, microbiome assessment, many other tests, and a conversation with you to come up with a full health optimization plan. What's the perfect diet, exercise, and supplement plan for you and only you? The Wild Health podcast is about optimizing all of us. Here we cover the cutting-edge science that gives you the base to be able to apply the personalized plan we give you as a patient. To sign up as a patient, go to wildhealth.com. Or if you're a physician or health coach and you want to learn how to do this for your patients, we're happy to help as well. Wildhealth.com for all the information on becoming a patient or working with us.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Wild Health Podcast. This is Carl Seger. I'm here with my buddy Mike Stone. How's it going, Mike?
It's amazing. How are you, Carl?
I'm actually pretty good. I'm still recovering from a bout of COVID, but I got my voice back, so we're rocking and rolling.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth calling you out that not only do you have your voice back, but you're like running and rucking and doing all sorts of things like a week and a half later. So superhero, life goals.
No, if you would have asked me a week ago, I think I would have been like, I may never walk again. I felt pretty terrible, but I'm back, baby.
I'm glad.
So I want to talk about Ozempic and well, not just Ozempic, GLP-1 agonist, because there was some recent stuff in the news. But before I say this, I'll just call myself out. I have been a very slow adopter and kind of more of a guy who's sitting on the sidelines on GLP-1 agonist. I have patients who are on GLP-1 agonists. So semaglutide or Ozempic, we'll go over all these, tirzepatide. I've been watching just kind of out of part of me has been morbidly interested in what's going to happen here. And then there's just been more and more data that's been really fascinating to me. And this is one of the piece of data that has come out around GLP-1s and in a recent study about decreased cognitive decline and decreased risk around Alzheimer's disease. Have you seen this?
Yeah,
I know you've seen this. I don't know why I asked him. I know you've seen this.
This is why we're here today. So yes, and I think I'd give a little bit of just background context here too. So one trend we're definitely seeing with GLP-1 agonists or GLP-1 receptor agonists is that they have an expanding range of utility. Like they're quickly turning into the Swiss Army knife of medications, right? So they're initially, evaluated and FDA cleared for type 2 diabetes and lowering hemoglobin A1C. Then, everybody who's taking them seems to lose weight. So then an obesity clearance. Then the cardiovascular outcome study that showed that folks on semaglutide had a lower risk of all-cause cardiovascular events over a period of time. So, now it's cardioprotective. And now you're starting to see some data around cognitive decline prevention and, reduction in inflammation and all sorts of other endpoints. So I'm just personally really excited to see where this goes. And a medication is never going to be a plug and play solution that solves all of your health issues. Right. So,
I think that's why I sit on the sideline whenever there's this overwhelming, this is the savior. I become I think this is just part of my nature. I become incredibly suspicious and where's the flip side, right? Nothing's for free. There's no free lunch, right?
Yeah. And I mean, we could dive deep into why both of us have that worldview and how we could go about continued healing. But
that's a different podcast.
That's a totally different podcast. Yeah. And there's also we've also seen it, right? I mean, fen was a very effective weight loss drug until people started having cardiovascular valve abnormalities, right? So it's okay to be skeptical of an FDA cleared medication that doesn't have 5 years, 10 years of follow-up for us to know what's going on. All that said, as background, yes, as of a day to 3 days ago, my news feed blew up with, The Guardian, weight loss drug could help slow Alzheimer's cognitive decline, trial finds. CNBC, older GLP-1 drug from Novo Nordisk may slow Alzheimer's disease progression. Like, this has been picked up by everybody. This is why it's on the quote unquote annoying articles newsfeed. Although I don't think there's anything annoying. I think the news generally did a really good job with this in terms of gaining excitement and like,
can we pause that for a second? When I saw the news feed, I definitely rolled my eyes and went, oh, great. Like everybody and their dog is going to be coming to me being like, I think I have cognitive decline or I have this or that. Like, start me on GLP-1 agonist now. When I read the articles, I was like, well, that's a very reasonable, sort of reserved response as, that. Like even in the CNN article, the first paragraph says these results need to be borne out in larger trials, which are underway before the medicines can receive approval for this disease process.
Yeah. So clap to the media. A lot of could and a lot of might and not a lot of does and should. So I was pretty happy with the coverage here. And maybe just the why is this in the news right now? Because this isn't the first time that people have looked into GLP-1 receptor agonists for cognitive decline prevention. And we can look at some of those data too. But this is because the Alzheimer's Association International Conference 2024 is going on in Philadelphia, and there's preliminary results being presented from a group that studied liraglutide or liraglutide. I never know how to pronounce any of the GLP-1 receptor agonists.
Liraglutide? That's how I thought
liraglutide is where I'm going, but who knows?
Yeah, but this is also the studies out of the UK, so they may pronounce it totally differently.
Yeah, well, I mean, there might be some aluminium involved. Who knows exactly what's going on? But this is it's a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial called Evaluating the Effects of the Novel GLP-1 Analog Liraglutide in Alzheimer's Disease. How that ended up as the ELAD trial, it's creative capitalization, which we see in all trials because they have to have a name. Paul Edison, MD, PhD from Imperial College London, was the lead study author. And they looked at 204 patients with mild Alzheimer's disease seen at 24 clinics throughout the UK. Each of them got a daily subcutaneous injection for a year. Half of them liraglutide and half of them placebo. And that's an interesting pickup. I feel like it would have been weekly. It was reported as daily. I wasn't at the conference. I'm gonna just say it doesn't really matter. They were getting liraglutide subcutaneously, and the other folks were not.
Can we one more pause? I want you to do what you're doing, and I want to hear this, but just to pause for people. So this is a phase 2B trial. So what that there's basically 5 phases of clinical trials, right? Like 0 through 4. Phase 2 is obviously early, but we're looking at efficacy and dosage in pretty small amounts, so small numbers. So 100 to 300 patients are most like phase 2A, and then usually 2B is a little bit more patients, as opposed to phase 3, which is looking at more into efficacy, but also looking at safety a lot more in depth, but then bigger numbers of patients, 1,000, 3,000, I think maybe up to 5,000. I could be wrong about that. Patients in a clinical trial. So that's where we're at in the process versus, then there's rollout and then follow up with that rollout in phase 4, just for people's knowledge base.
Yeah, I think it's a great call out, Carl. I mean, this isn't like a 10 people. This isn't an animal study. This is a human study. Yep. This isn't we took 20 people in each group. It's a pretty big study, but it isn't this. You need to have phase 3 clinical trials before there's going to be an indication for use approved by FDA, and there needs to be further follow-up. So we're still relatively early. I'm going to put a pin in that because guess what? There is a phase 3 randomized clinical trial going on on exactly this topic, and we'll talk about that. But basically what they found here or the primary endpoint in this study. So when you design a study, you have a primary endpoint. This is the main thing we're trying to prove with this study. And most studies also have secondary endpoints, which, hey, we're also going to look at this. We're also going to look at that. And this is a great example of that study. The primary endpoint in this study was cerebral glucose metabolic rate in specific areas of the brain. So how much did the metabolism of glucose change on functional MRI with using these liraglutide? They also looked at cognitive performance. So how did you do on cognitive testing? And they also looked at volume of the brain. So with Alzheimer's disease, the natural progression is that there's loss of brain tissue or cortical atrophy where the brain starts to shrink. So those were secondary outcomes. Does the brain shrink? Does it change how much it shrinks if you're taking liraglutide versus placebo? Do you perform the same on cognitive testing before and after the trial if you're on liraglutide versus placebo? And what they found was that cognitive function and brain volume both were significantly improved in the patients with mild cognitive decline on liraglutide. They didn't reach their primary endpoint, and they didn't show that the cerebral glucose metabolic rate changed in both subgroups.
This is what it surprised me, because I assumed when we had seen that there's trials going on around cognitive decline, if there was any improvement in that from a GLP-1 agonist, I assumed it was because of improved cerebral glucose control, right?
Yeah.
I mean, but what that makes me think is that the effects that these drugs have on neuroinflammation is a lot bigger than we thought. And that's what I took home from that, but I'm super fascinated what you took home from that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, Alzheimer's disease has been called type 3 diabetes, right? Or diabetes of the brain. We know that glycemic variability, so lots of variation in your blood glucose over time, as well as a higher baseline blood glucose over time in younger life, 20s, 30s, 40s, correlates to an increased risk of cognitive decline later in life. So seems like a reasonable conclusion to say tighter glycemic control is going to be protective against Alzheimer's disease. That is not a set in stone conclusion, although it's certainly the bulk of the data suggest that that's the case. So what I took away from this was GLP-1 receptor agonists, at least in the data that we have available to us now, probably have a little bit of a little statin magic going on, right? Where, statins are not just lipid lowering, but they're also anti-inflammatory. And how much of the effect is actually related to the chronic inflammation, which we know that chronic inflammation drives all of the chronic diseases of Western society, whether it's Alzheimer's, cancer, cardiovascular disease, metabolic dysfunction, it contributes to all of those. So if there's a strong anti-inflammatory effect from a GLP-1 receptor agonist, makes sense that it would have more than one protective effect on those risk factors. So what do we see so far with GLP-1s that we chatted about at the beginning of this talk? They decrease the risk of diabetes. They decrease the risk of cardiovascular disease. They seem to maybe decrease the risk of Alzheimer's. And we don't have studies on their use for cancer prevention. So I feel like, yes, there's almost certainly going to be an anti-inflammatory component. And how much of the protective effect, if there is one for Alzheimer's disease, comes from anti-inflammatory versus glycemic control, we need a bigger study.
Well, what's interesting is, so when you look at there's animal models for this, so animal models, but where they can demonstrate the pathways where they change how the inflammatory pathways that then lead to the modulation of amyloid precursor proteins, and so the cleavage of them that result in increased amyloid and also tau protein deposition, and can demonstrate decreased amyloid and tau protein deposition in these animals, and then but also have the biologic mechanism, and whether it through like reduction of neuroinflammation, reduce oxidative stress. So that's what part of the reason I went into that, like down that rabbit hole, was because of the fact that they didn't get their first, like the glucose control wasn't it. And when I read that, I was like, wait, what? Like I just made that assumption. And then now that like when you stand back and look at all this hodgepodge of effects that these GLP-1 agonists have, it's probably from a reduction of inflammation. Like that's what we see, like inflammation causing all these other things. It did make me make the leap that you kind of just did where like, is there a cancer reduction? Like, I'm super fascinated. I'm sure that study's coming out at some point, but which I haven't seen, but yeah.
Yeah. And, one other, before we maybe roll into talking about the phase 3 clinical trial that's underway and is available for, public viewing at clinicaltrials.gov. Something that kind of that I missed, at least in my news feed, and maybe this is where, if you live in the US, you don't get all of the current Swedish medical trials quite upfront in the news feed. But from Lancet, so about as solid as you get from a high impact, impressive journal. This is Lancet from July 2024. So we're podcasting together on August 2nd today, was a pretty large sequential trial emulation. So this isn't a randomized control trial. This is retrospective. They looked at 88,000 participants who were Swedish residents, 65 years or older, had type 2 diabetes, and started a GLP-1 agonist, dipeptidyl peptidase 4 inhibitor, or sulfonylureas. So different classes of medications to lower blood glucose. Yeah. They followed them for 10 years to look at the risk of dementia. And what did they find? Significant. So this is an intention to treat analysis. They didn't actually treat any patients. This was just observational of what had happened. So in an intention to treat analysis, GLP-1 agonist initiation was associated with a reduced risk of dementia compared to sulfonylureas. That's a hazard ratio of 0.69. And DPP-4 inhibitors, a hazard ratio of 0.77 after adjusting for age, year, gender, socioeconomics, health conditions, past medication uses. And they did this in several sensitivity analyses, including a per protocol analysis. And the hazard ratio just came out so much lower for GLP-1s. And a hazard ratio you can think of as, we don't need to dive into statistics. It's the risk of getting a disease for all intents and purposes. So here's another trial just kind of sneaking in there, not prospective, not randomized and controlled, going, wow, like a 30% relative risk reduction, 25 to 30%. That's huge.
Huge. Like I did not see that trial. I'm glad you brought that, because that is huge. That's crazy. Okay.
Yeah. So again, I think beyond hypothesis forming, not quite like ready for prime time as a solid evidence-based recommendation, but that's what the Evoke trial is doing. This is a sponsored trial from Novo Nordisk. So just putting that right out there. This is an industry-sponsored trial that's underway right now. They're enrolling, and they're looking at semaglutide or Ozempic. And they're doing 173 weeks is the goal. So like 3 years and 4 months. Participants are going to have 17 clinic visits. They're going to have a phone call as well with the doctor, multiple tests and scans. A lot of them are going to have, CSF analysis. So like a spinal tap or a lumbar puncture looking for tau and amyloid and telltale associative findings in Alzheimer's disease. And they're enrolling people with early cognitive decline and Alzheimer's, and they're going to look and see how do people do from a mild cognitive impairment standpoint, both on a imaging, functional, laboratory testing standpoint. So really excited to see this. I think this is going to be the trial that kind of gives us a real answer on this. It's a phase 3 clinical trial. They're using of interest oral semaglutide, which I think is really interesting because we don't really see a ton of that bubbling up, although there is what seems to me to be a pretty rapidly expanding body of literature suggesting that oral daily semaglutide is likely as effective as injectable subcutaneous once a week semaglutide, which could certainly lead to lower cost, could certainly lead to, there are some patients who just don't want to give themselves an injection. And on the other hand, if I needed to be on a GLP-1 receptor agonist for any reason, I would probably prefer to just inject something once a week than have another pill that I have to remember to take every day.
So that's it. That's interesting. I think we should unpack that, because if I had to do that, I would way rather, like I take a statin. I've been pretty open about that. I take
Thanks
a statin.
Thanks for sharing, Carl.
You're welcome. I would just add that to the same time. I'd just add a little pill box. Granted, to make me feel like an old man, but
have you seen my pill box, Carl? I don't know if I have room for oral semaglutide in there between the omegas and everything else you have me taking as my doctor. Like, I just feel like you're pumping me up with a ton of stuff.
That's not true. Like, I have you on like a couple things.
You're right. No, and I could be I like a sort of set it and forget it thing. So like the idea of a once weekly. I think maybe what I'm trying to say is if all of my supplements and medications could come in a once weekly injection, count me in. If I have to split it up, you're right. I'd probably just throw it in the pill bottle. I think I revised my stance on that. But anyway, they're using oral semaglutide in this versus oral placebo. And going to be fascinating to see what comes out of this. But this is one of those things where, we didn't have the data available to us to say proven weight loss with GLP-1 receptor agonists for a little while. We had proven reductions in hemoglobin A1C because that was the primary endpoint of a study, and it looked like there was a signal towards significant weight loss. And then you have to design a trial where that's your primary endpoint. This is just the way evidence-based research goes. And I think that it's exciting to see that this is happening, and there is going to be a trial where cognitive decline is really the primary endpoint for a prospective randomized controlled trial on a GLP-1 receptor agonist. And also kind of cool to be using a more modern one, right? Liraglutide, older medication. It's not something that people are super familiar with. I think that, semaglutide, tirzepatide, all over the place right now. And then here come the follow-up studies, right? Like, is tirzepatide more effective than semaglutide for cognitive decline? Who knows? So I think it's just an exciting time, honestly, for these medications. And just to bring it back to clinical practice and no free lunch, I think there are healthy ways to use these medications across a number of indications. And I think there are less healthy ways to use them. And I think if you're
for sure
taking semaglutide or tirzepatide and you don't exercise and you don't focus on meeting dietary protein goals, and they don't have to be excessive dietary protein goals, but they have to be, reasonable. You're definitely, in my clinical opinion, which we're not medical advice, but I'm sharing what I would say for a doctor talking to a patient. I think you're putting yourself at risk for sarcopenia. You're putting yourself at risk for losing muscle mass,
and therefore bone,
and therefore bone density, right? Yeah. So what we want and this is, I wouldn't go so far as to say this is a pet peeve, but this is a function of our societal language that I think we need to shift. We talk about weight loss all the time, and what we want to talk about and move towards talking about is fat loss. Nobody wants to lose muscle. Nobody wants to lose bone density. We want to lose fat. So I implore people, when you're talking with your clients, with your patients, with your family, the word fat has a lot of connotation. It is a fat cell. That's what it's called. It's a part of our tissue, the same way a muscle cell is a muscle cell and a bone cell is a bone cell. We're trying to lose fat mass. We're not trying to lose bone or muscle mass.
I would even push that a little further and say that it's about body recomposition, right? It's increasing muscle mass while losing fat at the same time, right? Or at least not losing muscle mass. So it's a recomposition of your body. And I have like so many patients that come to me and they want to look at their percentage of body fat. And I want to look at like, well, what's the distribution? What's your muscle mass? And so I wanted to, because like what you said, the fat has such a connotation with it. And like, I want it to be like, we're talking about body recomposition with patients, not fat loss, or weight or looking at a number. Right.
Yeah. And I think that's a language that I use as well. When I definitely talk about body recomposition. And at the same time, I'm just going to go out on a limb here and say there are societal and cultural constraints that limit us from feeling like we can have honest and forthright conversations with patients because we're worried about insulting them or having them feel that we're judging them. And this is one of those things that comes up all the time is you want to talk about energy balance and say, well, let's take aside hypothyroidism. Let's take aside other severe endocrine disorders or metabolic dysfunction. If you're losing weight, not talking about tissue type. If you're losing weight, you're likely in a negative energy balance. And if you're gaining weight, whatever type of tissue that is, you're likely in a positive energy balance. How do you change energy balance? You either eat less or eat more, or you move less or move more. And to be able to have an honest conversation that says, hey, if you're gaining weight and you're not trying to gain weight, or you're failing to lose weight and you're trying to lose weight, and again, substitute fat for weight through that whole thing. The reason is you're probably taking in more calories than you either want to or than you know. And that's a huge one, is people are not really sure what they're eating. Or you're moving less than you want to or than you know. And it's about having this honest framework to be able to say, I'm not here to call you a glutton or to say you're a sloth. This has no judgment attached to it. This is, let's dial in and actually measure what's coming in, what's going out. And then you can have a blueprint to figure out which way you want to go, where you want to pull the lever to change that energy balance if that's part of your goals. But I do think we're a little bit, hemmed in by this feeling like, well, if we tell someone they're eating too much, they're going to take that as a personal affront. And I think it's no judgment if someone does take it as a personal affront, but being able to have that conversation and open up the dialogue in a way where you can say, if I'm saying you're eating more than goal, you're overnourished, it is not a judgment about your ability to have willpower or your gluttony. This is going to be like metabolic balance and the law of conservation of energy. And we can talk about it in a way that's supportive and loving and not judgmental and, prescriptive. So I do like body comp. Sorry, Carl. One last thing. I do like body recomposition. Sure. I think it's very accurate. And at the same time, that is a term that most lay people are not familiar with if they're outside of the medical or fitness and wellness space. And people know what it means to save muscle tissue and lose fat, or save bone density and lose fat. And we can educate them around body recomposition. But there's also just this perceived barrier among healthcare providers that we can't just say, hey, we need to lose some fat mass. Like, that's a fact for some patients. And for some patients, we need to lose a lot of visceral adipose tissue, which is even more dangerous, right? So I don't know if we use adipose or fat, but this is just...
I think your point is well taken. And I actually think what you're describing is a big part of a societal issue, why we can't establish plans for people, because it's part of the barrier, because you don't have that conversation. You don't have that open conversation because of that awkward, and you're worried about offending somebody. So you can't get granular to what somebody's eating, activity, and all of these things because of that barrier. My point is with the fat thing is if the onus, I feel like the onus is on me to educate quickly around fat. What our goal is not the number on the scale. The goal is body recomposition, which means reduction in fat and increasing in muscle mass. And we're going to talk about body recomposition, and that's how we're going to frame it. And maybe that's my way to step around that conversation or whatever. Maybe that's my avoidance or whatever. And I can totally hold on to that. But I'm trying to get to success for people and get past that barrier so that they can move on and be like, okay, we're going to make it more scientific and objective and not personal. Right.
Yeah. And I think we're kind of talking.
We're saying the same thing.
Two sides of the same coin here. Body recomposition is probably, you could sum up in the framework that I use more commonly with patients as, we're going to lower your body fat percentage. Right. If you're lowering your body fat percentage, you're accomplishing the same goal. And it doesn't really matter what's happening to your weight. You could gain weight and lower your body weight. Yeah. So it's all the same thing. So anyway, just to land this plane, I think what I take away from this stuff bubbling up is, I do think that GLP-1 receptor agonists are going to play a larger and larger role in modern healthcare across a variety of chronic disease conditions. I also think there's no free lunch. And I think that, we haven't talked about it, but rare incidence of pancreatitis, which is a horrible thing that you don't want to have. Certainly like, very common instances of nausea, vomiting, upper abdominal discomfort, bloating, like many of these medications at higher doses in particular can lead to pretty uncomfortable adverse effects. So again, no free lunch. And when coupled with the right kind of lifestyle intervention, really, I think can help patients in a significant way. So I'm excited to see the results of the Evoke trial. Going to be continuing to follow this. Obviously, we'll hop back on the podcast if something else comes out that's cool around emerging indications for GLP-1 receptor agonists.
Totally. That was great. And I think what it also tells me is like I realize that in the future, this is going to get more dialed in, and I'm going to be less and less on the bench watching. I mean, like I said, I have some patients on GLP-1s, but it's going to have to get more in the game. And I'm excited to see what happens.
I'm going to throw one more thing in there. I know I'm landing the plane, but right as we're coming in, we're not going to abort the landing. We're going to still land, but we're just sort of circling. We're circling one more time. Which is where I'm most excited about the possibility for GLP-1 receptor agonists. And this is from a personal standpoint. So I just want to share with you and with anybody listening. There are genetic, epigenetic, and phenotypic people who, let's say, have an ApoE4 gene or two, who have a higher risk of dyslipidemia, which will increase their risk for cardiovascular disease. Those clients may not have, or those people may not have the financial means or the right insurance to get on a PCSK9 inhibitor or a bempedoic acid, and instead are on a statin that effectively lowers their lipids and reduces their long-term cardiovascular risk. But we know that in some subset of patients that long-term statin use can increase your risk for type 2 diabetes and for hyperglycemia. So is there a world in which you have a particular patient phenotype, and obviously everything I do is personalized to the patient, but there are almost tribes, if you will, of similar phenotypes in the tribe that has dyslipidemia and an ApoE4 risk, placing them at higher risk for dementia? Can you lower their lipids with something that may still raise their glucose and then simultaneously lower their glucose and reduce their long-term cognitive risk with a low dose of a GLP-1 receptor agonist? So this is sort of where I'm excited to see the future go. I don't think we have data to support that practice today, at least not I don't think we have data to say it's dangerous either, just to be on the record. But I don't think we have data to say, yes, this is what you should do. But what I'd love to see, and it's not going to come from Novo Nordisk or pharmacies or pharmaceutical sponsored trials, right? This is a misaligned incentive for them. Can you use a very, very, very tiny dose of our medicine, right?
Yes.
But if you used, say, a tenth of the maximum dose, so to borrow from the psychedelic parlance, a microdose of a GLP-1 receptor agonist.
Microdosing GLP-1s.
Could you get some measure of cognitive prevention or cognitive decline protection? Could you get some measure of glycemic control and not have the impact on blunting appetite and leading to caloric restriction that's unintentional? So just throwing that out there. That's what I'm excited to see. We'll see if anybody wants to pick that ball up and run with it.
Yeah, no, I mean, so what you just, the only piece of that, like I have been thinking about this intellectually with GLP-1s and people with ApoE4 for a little while now. I don't think you and I have ever actually had that conversation where you're like, okay, well, statin, that can be a problem. Like here's how we balance this. We can't do PCSK9 inhibitors because of cost. And like that is where that makes sense. The dosing thing is really interesting to me. And I would be interested in a trial, just low dose for a GLP-1 agonist alone and seeing outcomes, primary outcome being glucose control, and
I think that's exactly right. That's what I want to see is and we might, this is probably homework for us to just go back and see, did they have trials where they just maintained at the lowest starting dose? I'm sure that they did.
They had to.
And what did that glycemic control look like in those? I mean, we do know that there's a stepwise progression in weight loss which is what they measure. I'm not like flip-flopping between weight and fat. They're literally measuring weight. Weight loss at a higher dose of tirzepatide versus a starting dose, a higher dose of semaglutide versus a starting dose. We know that that's dose dependent. I'm curious, and I would presume that the hemoglobin A1C reduction is dose dependent, but is it enough to be clinically meaningful at a very low dose? And we do know that the adverse effects are dose dependent. So can you run somebody very low, and how low can you go on a GLP-1 and still get glycemic control? So we'll keep our eye out for anything happening there. And Carl, this is really exciting stuff, right? I mean, how often in medicine is there a whole like new class of medications that really seems like it's going to have a positive impact across so many areas of health?
This is, I mean, it's like, it's a cheesy statement, but it's a very exciting time in medicine.
It sure is. It sure is, Carl.
It's
amazing.
All right, man. It's good to talk to you.
Fun as always.
All right. Take care.
All right, brother. See you soon. That's all for this episode. Thanks everyone for listening. And if you're looking for more, be sure to follow us on social at WildHealthMD and head over to wildhealth.com or wildhealth.com/premium to become a patient and experience precision medicine for yourself.